So, let's talk about Descartes' meditations. As I've said before, this is, one of the most influential, one of the most famous, and one of the most written about texts in the Western canon. It's really, in a sense, the founding text of modern European philosophy. What I want to do when we read at least the first 4 of these 6 meditations together is, of course, first of all, to help you understand what's going on, to help you, understand the basic ideas, the basic arguments, and so on. But I would also like to sort of, instruct ourselves in the art of carefully reading a philosophical text. I want us to really look at the text, what's going on in the text, to not believe that we already know in advance what's going to happen in the text. That is really one of the pitfalls you have when you read something that is famous, the idea that you already know what Descartes is going to say, and therefore you kind of read it and you think, yeah, that all fits my preconceptions, even if the text itself might actually be rather different. And I want us to ask some serious questions, right? To get into the habit of looking at a philosophical text and asking serious questions of the text and of ourselves, because that is the way towards further comprehension. So actually one of the techniques that I would like to try in these lectures is that at some point I'm going to ask a question, maybe repeat it, and if you want to, and I actually recommend it, you might want to pause the video at that moment, reflect on what you've read in the text, try to answer the question for yourself, and then turn it on again to see whether, your answer has anything to do with mine or not. Okay, in this particular video, what I would like to do is I would like to think about Cartesian doubt. Right? We all know, I think, maybe already in advance, before we've even read this text, that Descartes is going to give us some skeptical hypotheses. The most famous of which is going to be the evil demon, right? Descartes is famous for his evil demon argument, which is basically that there could be an evil demon that deceives me totally in everything I seem to perceive, maybe even everything I seem to think, and therefore my entire perception of the world, my entire idea about the world in which I live, could be wrong, right? And this would seem to lead us immediately to some kind of terrible skepticism, right? Oh no, maybe everything I know is wrong. How can I ever find something that is true? Ooh, and then the rest of the meditations is Descartes' attempt to set this skeptical worry aright. Well, in a sense that's true. But there's also, I think, a very important sense in which it's not true, in which it's false, in which it is at the very least a deceptive and one-sided picture of what is going on in the meditations in general, and this first meditation in particular. And so what I would like to do is I would like us to look at the text and think about this Cartesian doubt. Right? What's the point of doubt? How do we get to doubt? The story I've just been telling you seems to suggest that it's very easy to fall into doubt, right? The traditional, the skeptic, the way that we tend to think about skepticism nowadays, is somebody who is almost tormented by doubts and thinks, oh no, I can't know anything, and is looking for some way out. And that definitely doesn't seem to be the situation that the Cartesian thinker here, the I of the meditations, is in. Okay, so let's look at the very beginning of the meditations, and I will sometimes read out a sentence or two, and depending on the translation that you use, it might be exactly the same as yours or not the same as yours, but you'll be able to find it in the text, I think, without too much trouble. This one's very easy because it's the very beginning of meditation 1. Several years have now passed since I first realized how numerous were the false opinions that in my youth I had taken to be true, and thus how doubtful were all those that I had subsequently built upon them. And thus I realized that once in my life I had to raze everything to the ground and begin again from the original foundations if I wanted to establish anything firm and lasting in the sciences. Here's maybe the first question that we should ask ourselves. And if you want to, after I've given you the question, you might want to hit that pause button and think about it for a little bit. Who is this I? Right, we're in the first person. There's an I here. It's going to be a kind of a story of this I who does things, who is going to engage in these doubts, who's going to, try to get out of these doubts, who's going to, really on a wild adventure. Who is this I? Is it Descartes? Or is it someone else? Who is it? Well, I think it's kind of clear that although it might seem autobiographical, right, a text that starts with this I, this is clearly not an autobiographical text, right? I mean, nobody believes that Descartes sat down in a room and thought, okay, now in 6 days I'm going to, do this project. And on day 1 he wrote meditation 1, and on day 2 he wrote meditation 2, and so on. That's definitely not what's going on in Descartes' life. I mean, Descartes has been thinking about these things for decades, maybe. Definitely for years. He's worked it all out, and now he's going to write it down. And he chooses to write it down in this sort of fictional form, this first-person story about a person who meditates for 6 days in order to, receive, in the end, get to the truth, right? In order to somehow improve his epistemic situation. So the I is definitely not Descartes himself. This is not autobiography. Which leaves us the question, though, why does Descartes choose the first person? Why does he write a story about this nameless meditator? In the literature about the meditations, this person is often called the meditator. Why does he write it this way? Well, I think we can find a hint to that in Descartes' Preface to the Reader. Here is what Descartes says at some point in the Preface to the Reader. He says, "I do not advise anyone to read these things, except those who have both the ability and the desire to meditate seriously with me, and to withdraw their minds from the senses as well as from all prejudices." What Descartes wants, and earlier in the preface he has even said that he wrote this in Latin so that the common people couldn't read it, right? Because it would be too difficult and dangerous for them. Now, this is only for people who want to meditate with Descartes. He wants you to sort of settle into this, read it, and sort of do all these steps for yourself. And this I, the story about this I who actually does this, and who at a certain point thinks, whoa, now I've read a lot, I've thought a lot, let's go to sleep and let it sink in and go on tomorrow. Those are sort of Descartes' instructions, right? He's like, okay, read this, then let it sink in. And once you've really grasped what's going on in the first meditation, we can move on to the next one. I think that's sort of the backstory here. That's the reason that Descartes chooses this form. I believe that there is a letter of Descartes to a friend where he says that actually people might need several months for every meditation, right, to really get into the right state and be ready to move on to the next one. Okay, so that's what I want to say about the I of the meditations here. Now, this I finds themselves in the situation that they find out that some of the things that they always believed were false, were wrong. Okay, that might be worrisome, right? If these things that I believed were wrong, then maybe other things that I believed are wrong as well. And so this I decides, the meditator decides, to raise everything to the ground and begin anew from the original foundations. And the meditator thinks that he has to do that if he wants to establish anything firm and lasting in the sciences. And I'm saying he, by the way, even though the text gives no indication of the gender of the meditator. So maybe I shouldn't do that. But probably Descartes is thinking about a man, given that he's writing in the early 17th century. But okay, that's something that I'm putting in Descartes' mouth, in a sense. The idea that the meditator would be a man. Clearly, for us, this is not relevant. It's relevant if we want to understand sex and gender in the 17th century. For us, all of us, we are supposed to follow these meditations and try to get as far as we can, right? Okay, so what about doubt? Well, the meditator doesn't find himself in a situation of doubt, right? It's not the case that the meditator has woken up and thinks, maybe everything is false. That doesn't seem to be the case at all. No, the meditator knows that some of the things that he knows are false. But now he wants to go to the foundations, right? He wants to raise everything to the ground and start building anew. And so he needs to remove everything that stands in his way. Everything that might be false. We've already heard in the quote I gave you from the preface that what these meditations ought to be doing is they ought to be taking you ought to withdraw your mind from the senses as well as from all prejudices. That's what Descartes is going to try to do. He's going to try to get us to withdraw our mind from the senses and leave behind all prejudices so that we can go and find the truth. The entire first meditation, almost the entire first meditation, is going to exist of arguments that generate doubt. Right? Descartes is going to actively try to generate doubt. Why? Because he thinks that these arguments are correct? Because he thinks that we ought to be skeptics? No, of course not. Right? We're going to find out at the end that these arguments are not correct. And Descartes definitely doesn't want us to become skeptics. That's absolutely not his aim. He thinks we can have very, very good knowledge indeed. No. The doubt that Descartes, the reason that Descartes is talking about doubt here seems to be methodological. And so a lot of commentators have talked about Descartes' method of doubt. Right? Descartes is trying to instill doubt in us because that will allow us to, distance ourselves from sensation. That's going to turn out to be very important. To leave behind our prejudices. That's going to be very important too if we want to arrive at the truth. And start on a serious philosophical project for the first time. So doubt is not some kind of bad situation from which we need to be delivered. Doubt is something we need to seek out. We need to seek it out because it's the methodological starting point for getting at the right philosophy. And so Descartes is going to give us all these arguments, which are supposed to show that, we can really doubt all of this stuff, all this sensory stuff at the very least, and probably all the non-sensory stuff as well, a little later on in the meditation. That's going to create the conditions in which real and serious philosophy can be done. In fact, one of the things I like here is that the evil demon, as it's habitually known, he calls it an evil genius here in my translation. A genius is not in this case somebody who's very smart, but another word for a spirit or demon. An evil genius. The evil genius doesn't really come in as a new argument. Right? It's not in the end really Descartes' argument for doubt. He already has given his supreme argument for doubt just before. He has told us, well, what is Descartes' supreme argument for doubt? Maybe that's we have a sort of sequence of arguments for doubt, ending with a kind of supreme, a super powerful one that encompasses both the senses and things that are not of the senses, maybe even our mathematical convictions. What is the supreme argument for doubt? Well, I would say it's a kind of either-or argument, right? Descartes says, well, suppose there's a God who is able to do anything. Well, if God is able to do anything, then presumably God could also create me in such a way that I'm constantly wrong, right? God could create me in such a way that I'm totally wrong in how I perceive the world, but at the same time, maybe also totally wrong about mathematics, right? I think, 2 plus 3 is 5. Yeah, maybe God has made me in such a way that that's what I think, although in fact, 2 plus 3 is 7, right? That seems to be something that Descartes puts on the table here. And we're going to see later on in the meditations maybe that things are not that black and white, that there is knowledge that we can be really certain about. But at this point, it seems a fair possibility. And Descartes notices that, people might object that God is supposed to be good, right? And if he's good, then why would he do this? But Descartes says, well, I'm sometimes wrong. If God is good, what? If God really wanted me to be right, how does error even happen? Right? I mean, how is it that I'm sometimes wrong? So, yeah, he doesn't really give an answer to that here, but he sort of puts this forward as, well, at this stage in the meditation, it seems that the possibility that I was created by an all-powerful God, that allows me to doubt even my mathematical convictions. Okay. But what if you don't really buy into this idea of God? Right? Descartes says, perhaps there are some who would rather deny so powerful a God than believe that everything else is uncertain. Let us not oppose them. Rather, let us grant that everything said here about God is fictitious. Now they suppose that I came to be what I am, either by fate, or by chance, or by a connected chain of events, or by some other way. But because being deceived and being mistaken appear to be a certain imperfection, the less powerful they take the author of my origin to be, the more probable it will be that I am so imperfect that I am always deceived. So suppose that God, this all-powerful God, didn't create me, but I was created by some other cause. Well, that cause is by definition not all-powerful, not perfect. So much the less perfect will I be. Right? If I was created by pure chance alone or something like that, well, that doesn't bode very well to my, abilities. Why would pure chance create something that is good at finding out the truth? Or why would some other imperfect cause succeed at making a being that is really good at finding the truth? So if God created me, I can doubt everything because God is all-powerful and he could make me wrong about everything if he wanted to. But if I was not created by God, but by some other cause, then, wow, the imperfection of that cause seems to be a ground for doubt, because I must be imperfect too, and maybe I'm wrong about everything. So either way, really, Descartes says, it doesn't really matter how you think about your own origin. There's always room for doubt. Okay, and that's going to allow us to, hopefully, get rid of prejudices. Distance ourselves from the senses, I'll say more about that in another video, and get going with the real philosophy. It's only after he has done all that the evil genius is going to make an appearance. In a, I think, somewhat unexpected, even almost funny way, I would say. Descartes says, it is not enough simply to have realized these things. we're not just doing an argument, right? We are engaged in meditation. And in meditation, something must happen. I want to put myself into a certain state. And Descartes is really thinking about the psychology here. He's really thinking about how to do this, how to get me ready for finding philosophical truth. He says, I must take steps to keep myself mindful of them. For long-standing opinions keep returning, and almost against my will, they take advantage of my credulity, as if it were bound over to them by long use and the claims of intimacy. Nor will I ever get out of the habit of assenting to them and believing in them, so long as I take them to be exactly what they are, namely, in some respects doubtful, as has just now been shown, but nevertheless highly probable, so that it is much more consonant with reason to believe them than to deny them. Hence, it seems to me I would do well to deceive myself by turning my will in completely the opposite direction and pretend for a time that these opinions are wholly false and imaginary, until finally, as if with prejudices weighing down each side equally, no bad habit should turn my judgment any further from the correct perception of things. For indeed I know that meanwhile there is no danger or error in following this procedure, and that it is impossible for me to indulge in too much distrust, since I am now concentrating only on knowledge, not on action. And therefore, he says, let's come up with this idea of an evil genius. Because that's going to help me. If I think of this evil genius, that there might be a demon who deceives me about everything, that's going to help me understand. No, that's going to help me sort of free myself from prejudices. Right? All these prejudices, they're pulling at me. I'm so used to living with them. They're so used to determining my ways of thinking. I need a psychological counterweight, and that's the demon. Okay. So that's the way this is supposed to work. Set up this psychological situation, really, of doubt, of freeing the mind from prejudice. So this passage that I just read out loud to you, here's a question I want to ask you about it. What is surprising about it? What is surprising about this passage? This passage just before the evil demon gets introduced. So I'd like you to read it over once more. Think about it and try to formulate what is strange about it. So let's look at it, right? He's talking about these long-standing opinions. And we're really talking about opinions like, oh, there really is a pencil here and I have a body and, the objects of the senses exist and 2 + 2 is 4. These are the opinions we're talking about. And he says that I'll never get out of the habit of assenting to them and believing in them, so long as I take them to be exactly what they are. Or if I take something to be exactly what it is, that means that I'm right. Right? So it's going to be reasonable to do the following, but if I do the reasonable thing, the meditation doesn't work. That's what Descartes is suggesting here. I'll never get out of the habit of assenting to them, so long as I take them to be exactly what they are, namely, in some respects doubtful, as has just now been shown, but nevertheless highly probable, so that it is much more consonant with reason to believe them than to deny them. All these arguments for doubt, Descartes says, they only get you so far. If somebody comes along and says, look, okay, there might be some doubt that there really is a pencil here, but surely it's reasonable to believe that there actually is a pencil here. Then Descartes is going to say yes. It's perfectly reasonable. Absolutely. Nothing I have just said shows that it is not reasonable. Once again, what I want to stress here is that Descartes is clearly thinking about his arguments here not as proving skepticism. Oh, and now we're in trouble and we have to try and get out of skepticism. He's really trying to use doubt as a sort of psychological method for freeing us from prejudice. And what he points out is that, okay, these doubts, they're nice, but they're not that powerful. right? It's still a lot more reasonable to believe in my normal beliefs, even though they might be wrong. So it doesn't really free my mind, right? My mind is not really freed by just giving these arguments. I need to do something more. And so he says, it seems to me I would do well to deceive myself. So we're now going to do something to deceive ourselves, right? This first step in philosophy turns out to be that I have to do something irrational in a sense. Irrational in at least a first order way, though it might be irrational in a higher order sense. It's irrational to believe that I should really doubt whether there's a pencil here if I'm interested in the existence of pencils, but I'm not, right? I'm at a higher level. I'm trying to do fundamental philosophy. And if I want to do fundamental philosophy, I should artificially get myself into this kind of unreasonable state where I doubt the existence of pencils, because that's the only state in which I can really start doing serious philosophy. Otherwise, the prejudices will grab me and stop me from finding the truth. So we must deceive ourselves. I must deceive myself by turning my will in completely the opposite direction and pretend that these opinions are wholly false and imaginary. I pretend that there is no pencil, that it's just wrong. And then this pretension and the habit might sort of balance each other out and make my mind blank. And no bad habit should turn my judgment any further from the correct perception of things. And Descartes goes on to say, to sort of reassure people that don't worry about the consequences of this, right? You can pretend all these weird irrational things. It's not dangerous. It's not dangerous because I'm concentrating only on knowledge, not on action. Suppose that I did this for ethics, right? If I go out and I say to people, look, I have this really strong prejudice that it's a bad thing to murder people in the street. But I'm going to pretend that that's wholly imaginary, that it's great to murder people in the streets, just to get into a psychological balance. Then people will be getting really worried, I hope. Because I might just start murdering people, right? And Descartes says, no, look, nothing like that is going to happen. We're just doing philosophy here. We're just interested in theory. Nothing bad is going to result from this. So, here's one thing I want you to take away from the first meditation. It is that Descartes doesn't give arguments, apparently, that he himself believes to prove skepticism. Oh, and now we have to get out of skepticism by some even better arguments. Right? There would be even something incoherent in that. How can you prove skepticism and then prove that it's false? No. This is a method that he's engaged in. He believes that there are some really fundamental ways in which we tend to misconstrue and misunderstand the world around us. A lot of them having to do with how we think about sensation. And we need to lose that so we are able to rethink everything and get at the truth.